My ex-wife was killed because of me. James sat in the dimly lit living room, the only light coming from the faint glow of the TV in the distance. He was in his late 30s, with bloodshot eyes that told the story of countless sleepless nights. A glass of whiskey was loosely held in his hand, and his gaze was fixed on a spot in the room, his thoughts far away. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The quiet was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air around him was weighed down by the burden of his thoughts. In his mind, James could hear his own voice, reflecting on the past, with a tone filled with regret. He hadn't seen it coming. How could he have? He believed they were happy once, but now he wondered if that happiness was just a lie he had told himself, a comforting illusion that kept him blind to the truth. He took a sip of his whiskey, the burn in his throat doing little to shake him from his reverie. His eyes shifted to a framed photograph on the coffee table, a picture of him and Laura, his ex-wife, on their wedding day. They were smiling, lost in a moment of blissful ignorance. He whispered her name, his voice trembling with the weight of his emotions. He thought they had everything, but now he realized how wrong he had been. In his mind, the scene shifted to a brighter, sunnier day. He remembered a morning in their dining room. Laura, in her early 30s, was sitting across from him at the breakfast table, casually scrolling through her phone with a small smile on her lips. James, glancing up from his newspaper, noticed how distracted she seemed and asked, in a cheerful tone, what had her so entertained. Laura quickly hid her phone, her smile faltering for just a moment before she forced it back. She told him it was nothing, just a silly meme from her friend Kate, something he wouldn't understand. James laughed, shaking his head, and returned to his newspaper, unaware of the tension beneath her calm exterior. Laura's eyes flickered with a trace of guilt as she took another bite of her toast, but James missed it entirely. He should have known, he thought bitterly. The signs were there, the sudden secretiveness, the late-night texts, the excuses to stay out late. But he hadn't questioned it. He trusted her. His memory drifted to another night, one that felt like a lifetime ago. They were in bed, but Laura was turned away from him, pretending to be asleep. James lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, a growing unease gnawing at him. It was a small thing, but it planted the seed of doubt that would eventually shatter his world. The unease that had taken root in James's mind only grew stronger with time. At first, he tried to dismiss it, telling himself that he was overthinking, that Laura was just busy or stressed. But the little things kept adding up. Her distant demeanor, the way she would smile at her phone, but never share what was so amusing, the new passwords on her devices. Eventually, the doubt became too much to ignore, and James found himself consumed by the need to know the truth. One evening, after Laura had left the house to meet a friend, James couldn't take it anymore. He searched through her things, driven by a mix of desperation and dread. It didn't take long before he found what he was looking for, a series of text messages on her tablet, ones that hadn't synced with her phone's new password protection. The messages were from a man named Ryan, someone James recognized as a mutual friend. As he read through the texts, his heart sank. The flirtatious banter, the intimate language, and the plans to meet up late at night all pointed to the undeniable truth. Laura had been cheating on him for over a year. James felt his world collapse around him. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless and reeling. He couldn't believe that the woman he had loved, the woman he had shared his life with, had been lying to him for so long. Anger, hurt, and confusion swirled within him, each emotion vying for dominance. For a moment, he considered confronting Laura directly, demanding answers. But as he sat there, staring at the incriminating messages, his anger began to take on a life of its own. Confrontation didn't seem enough. He wanted her to feel the pain he was feeling, to suffer for what she had done. Fueled by rage, James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of handling the situation privately, he went on a mission to expose Laura's infidelity to everyone around her. He informed her parents, her siblings, and even her friends, people who looked up to her, people she had always cared about pleasing. Laura's family was deeply religious and conservative, and James knew exactly how they would react to the news. It wasn't just about getting back at her, it was about ruining her reputation, making sure she could never live down the shame of what she had done. At first, there was little response. Laura's family was shocked and devastated, but they didn't immediately act on the information. James noticed Laura's attempts to reach out to him, to explain or apologize, but he ignored them. He was too consumed by his own sense of righteousness, too determined to make her pay. But as the weeks passed, the tension grew unbearable. Their divorce was finalized, and Laura's once close relationships with her family and community began to unravel. James should have felt vindicated, but instead an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He tried to convince himself that she deserved it, that he had done what was right. But the gnawing sense of guilt wouldn't go away. The regret that James initially dismissed as weakness soon began to take hold of him. He had thought that exposing Laura's betrayal would bring him closure, but it only left him feeling empty. And as he lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, the consequences of his actions weighed heavily on him. He had set something terrible in motion, and deep down he feared what might come next. 2 months had passed since the divorce was finalized, but the aftermath of James's actions was far from over. The gossip had spread quickly, and Laura's once tight-knit family began to unravel under the weight of the scandal. She had become a pariah in her own community, shunned by those who had once been closest to her. Her family, devout and conservative, found themselves caught between their love for her and the shame that her actions had brought upon them. Tensions rose, whispers grew louder, and the atmosphere around them became suffocating. James watched from a distance as Laura's life crumbled. He heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved in with a distant cousin, trying to escape the constant judgment that followed her wherever she went. He tried to convince himself that this was what she deserved, that she was merely reaping what she had sown. But the satisfaction he had anticipated never came. Instead, he was haunted by an uneasy feeling that only grew with time. Then, one day, James received a call that would shatter whatever remained of his world. It was Laura's younger sister, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. Laura had been found dead in her cousin's home, killed by a relative who believed she had brought dishonor to the family. The details were murky, but the message was clear. Laura had been murdered, and James knew, deep down, that it was because of him. The news hit James like a freight train. He could hardly breathe as the reality of what he had set in motion came crashing down on him. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He had wanted her to suffer, to feel the sting of betrayal as he had, but he had never imagined that it would cost her life. The guilt that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into full-blown despair. He had been so consumed by his anger, so blinded by his desire for revenge, that he hadn't considered the consequences of his actions. And now Laura was dead because of him. James spiraled into a dark place after that. The nights became unbearable, filled with nightmares that left him gasping for breath. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the image of Laura's lifeless body burned into his mind. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the crushing weight of his guilt. He avoided people, stopped answering calls, and isolated himself from the world. The whiskey that had once been a temporary escape now became a constant companion, numbing him to the horror of what he had done. He couldn't stop thinking about Laura, her smile, her laugh, the way she used to light up a room, but now all those memories were tainted by the knowledge of what he had destroyed. He began to replay every decision he had made, every word he had spoken in those fateful weeks leading up to her death. If only he had handled it differently. If only he had chosen a different path, but it was too late for that now. The damage was done, and there was no going back. As the days turned into weeks, James knew he couldn't go on like this. The guilt was eating him alive, and he needed help before it consumed him completely. He finally reached out to a therapist, though even that felt like a hollow gesture. What good could therapy do when it couldn't change the past? But he had no other options. He was drowning. and this was his only lifeline. Each therapy session was a struggle. Talking about what he had done, about the choices that had led to Laura's death, was like reopening a wound that refused to heal. But he forced himself to keep going, to keep talking, because he knew that if he didn't, the darkness inside him would swallow him whole. Still, every night, the nightmares returned. They were relentless, a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed. And no matter how much time passed, the guilt never lessened. It was a burden he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. James's journey through therapy was anything but straightforward. Each session peeled back layers of his guilt and shame, exposing wounds that had festered in the dark corners of his mind. He confessed to his therapist the overwhelming regret that haunted him, the weight of knowing that his actions had led to Laura's death. The therapist listened patiently, guiding James through the murky waters of his grief and self-reproach. But despite their progress, James found it nearly impossible to forgive himself. He had been so consumed by his anger, so blinded by his need for retribution, that he had failed to see the monstrous consequences of his choices. The nightmares persisted, cruel reminders that sleep offered no respite from his torment. Every night, he relived the moment he had discovered the affair, the moment he had decided to expose Laura. He saw her face, not with the anger and betrayal that had once driven him, but with the realization of what his actions had cost. In these dreams, Laura was always just out of reach, her expression a mixture of sorrow and accusation, her voice silent yet deafening in its reproach. No matter how many times his therapist reassured him that he couldn't have predicted what would happen, James knew that the guilt was his to bear alone. Despite the pain, there were small, incremental signs of healing. James began to see that while he could never undo what had been done, he could strive to live differently, moving forward. Therapy taught him to acknowledge his feelings without being consumed by them, to understand the triggers that sent him spiraling into darkness. He learned to face his guilt head-on, recognizing it as a part of himself but not the whole. Gradually, he started to reconnect with the world around him, albeit cautiously. He reached out to old friends, took walks outside, and began to reclaim the parts of his life that had been lost in the aftermath of Laura's death. But even as he took these tentative steps forward, the specter of what had happened remained ever present. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living on borrowed time, that every moment of peace was a fragile thing that could be shattered at any moment. James knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be something granted by others or by Laura's memory. It would have to come from within. And that, he realized, was the hardest thing of all. To forgive himself would mean accepting that he was capable of such cruelty. And that was a truth he struggled to come to terms with. As months turned into years, the sharp edges of his pain began to dull, though they never disappeared entirely. James continued his therapy, committed to the process even when it felt like an endless uphill climb. He came to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on, but about learning to live with the past without letting it define him. It was about finding a way to honor Laura's memory without being crushed by it, to acknowledge the tragedy without letting it consume him entirely. In time, James began to see glimmers of hope. He found moments of solace in the ordinary, reading a book, listening to music, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. These small moments didn't erase the past, but they reminded him that life could still hold beauty, even actions, and he didn't want to. The guilt would always be a part of him, a reminder of what he had lost and what he had done. But as he learned to carry that burden with more grace, he also learned to carry himself with more compassion. James wasn't the same person he had been before Laura's death, and he never would be. But through the darkness, he had found a way to keep going, to keep living, even when it seemed impossible. And in that, he discovered the first steps toward a kind of peace, not an absence of pain, but an acceptance of it, and a commitment to moving forward despite it. He had lost so much, But he hadn't lost everything. And as he took one day at a time, he held on to that fragile thread of hope, believing that somehow, somewhere, he might find a way to forgive himself after all.